I'm Jenna Bush, contributing author to the Psych Geeks book series, entertainment journalist, and co-host of a hysterical podcast. So welcome to the LibertyCon Hollyweird Science panel. So before I have everyone introduce themselves, I'm going to read the description of the panel because I'm very excited about this, and it is said better than I ever could. For science fiction productions, there is an implied bargain between the screenwriter and the audience. Suspend your disbelief on one or two fantastic notions, and the other parts of the story will be grounded in the believable. The genre is predicated on the expectation of one or two key inaccuracies per story. In recent years, however, both experts and fans have been nitpicking even the fundamental story conceits of films such as Gravity, Interstellar, The Martian, and Tenet. From the anything-goes storytelling approach of the 1950s and 1960s sci-fi, these panelists will explore whether or not the science accuracy pendulum of audience expectation has swung too far in the other direction. So I am going to start with Kevin. Introduce yourself and tell us what you do.
I'm Dr. Kevin Grazier. By education, I'm a planetary dynamicist. I spent 15 years on the Cassini mission as the investigation scientist for the main camera. I've also consulted on several TV series and films, most notably Battlestar Galactica and Eureka in television, and the film Gravity and the latest Pirates of the Caribbean movie in film. Upcoming, there's Persephone and Escape Room Tournament of Champions.
Nice. And Stephen?
My name is Stephen Cass. I am a longtime science and technology journalist, so I've written for people like Popular Science, Discover, MIT Tech Review, Nautilus, and I currently am a senior editor at the greatest magazine you've never heard of called IEEE Spectrum, which really is amazing, and our website is free. Check it out. And I also kind of have a sideline in science and science fiction. So I'm a co-author with Kevin on the first two Hollyweird Science volumes. There we go. And I've also edited a couple of original science fiction anthologies.
Awesome. And Michael?
Yeah, I'm a professor of astronomy at the University of Wyoming, specializing in accreting supermassive black holes that we know as quasars. I use telescopes like Hubble and Chandra, and any telescopes that let me get my hands on. I also teach astronomy to professional science fiction writers and writers of all kinds, really, at the Launchpad Astronomy Workshop for Writers. I'm a science fiction novelist. I've got a couple of books out with Tor, Star Dragon, and Spider Star. I do some editing as well. I edited an anthology called Science Fiction by Scientists for Springer as part of their science and fiction line. And as part of that line, I am also involved in the editing of Hollyweird Science.
He's the first person that gets to tell us our stuff sucks, is what he said.
Not the last.
I point out the smallest typos I can possibly find.
Oh, that's great. I'm all for that, because it's amazing how many eyes can be on a book. And the second you receive the hard copy, literally the second I got the second book, I found 5 typos within 5 minutes. It was like, it's, you know.
I copy edit some of the Psych Geeks books, so I understand completely. I do want to start, actually, Kevin, on Eureka. You had a different science discipline as sort of a guest star every week. And did you have problems with people nitpicking science in your show, or is this more of like a recent thing?
Yes and no. There's always been nitpickers. You ask nerds about nitpicking, they say, well, that's what we do. And I have to admit that being a nerd, I am among that cadre. You know, that's part of the nerd, the fanish nerd. That's why we go to conventions and experience, fanish, nerdish fellowship, is to complain about our favorite shows. But at the same time, so there was a little bit, but it wasn't nearly as bad as it is now, and largely because social media, in particular Twitter, wasn't as big of a thing back then. It existed, but it wasn't as big of a thing. I mean, you make a slight mistake now, and you get blasted on Twitter in a heartbeat. So sure, and part of that is also the formula of Eureka, because in Eureka, we did the speculative. We took what we knew, we took cutting edge research, and then we pushed it 30 to 50 years in the future and said, what might this become? So, some were hits and some, not so much.
I love this show. I think they were all hits. So we do have some questions that were submitted online. Some of them were from Mike, so you may have fun answering these. So I'll start with, how have audience expectations about the scientific content of entertainment changed over the years? Has the task of meeting these expectations gotten harder or easier?
Yeah, ultimately, I think it's gotten harder for a certain segment of the audience. I think overall, actually, a lot of that early criticism where people were just what was called the Hollywood curriculum, where people were just recycling science fiction ideas they'd seen in their childhood, and there were a whole bunch of tropes that had gotten very stale and very overused. And I think in the 90s and 2000s, I think there was a real wave of freshness where people started using science consultants and the science got better. But then again, you do have this, and people were communicating via Usenet. Like before social media, there was Usenet, and people were like chatting back and forth. But now it really seems like people are there is a cadre of people who really they're just trying to like score points, and they will just say, which I think is just reductive, because if you're genuinely interested in improving science literacy, you don't go, hey, that movie that got you really interested in, a star formation, or kind of got you interested in evolution or DNA. That was the stupidest thing I've ever seen, and you should be, why would anybody have enjoyed watching that terrible train wreck? And I just think that's very counterproductive. It's very easy in the moment to pile on, and I think that's part of the whole sort of like, well, actually kind of culture that there's a lot of Twitter has. So I think there's one segment of the audience that's gotten really very, very noisy. But I think in general, I think people are kind of happy with the quality of the science, because there are less ouchies going on. We don't have swamps on Venus. When shows go to Mars, it's actually a reasonably good facsimile of Mars, even on a low budget show. It's a better version of it's a better version of what Mars is than what NASA thought it was in the 1950s. So, because we've sent so many probes and all those visual images are in our heads. So I think for I think a lot of people they don't complain because they're happy.
And can I take that a little bit of what Stephen said and going on with it? Early on in doing Hollyweird Science, we made the conscious decision to stick to the positive as much as possible. Instead of going film by film by film and saying, this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong, we go topic by topic by topic and pick the good examples, if someone wants to use the book to teach. But as far as the actual question, as far as easier or harder, and again, that's a mixed bag. People are more likely to complain. They're also more likely to complain and be wrong. We did some things in Battlestar. The scene, one of my most famous examples is the scene where we blew Callie and Chief out the airlock. Oh, they'd freeze. Oh, they'd explode, which is because you saw the tropes that Stephen alluded to just moments ago, when in fact neither would happen. Mm-hmm. They would suffocate, or maybe an artery would burst, but they wouldn't freeze for a few hundred or 1,000 years. They wouldn't pop unless they held their breath. So there are people who have been conditioned to things. So you're going to get complaints. But as far as the actual making it easier or harder, we tend to have more people who actually have heard that there are science advisors being used, and they're generally willing to use them. Mm-hmm. So it's sometimes they're more willing to incorporate the helpfulness or the use of a science advisor. So in that respect, it's kind of easier, because once one production does it, well, we want that too. They don't always listen to the science advisor. That's another topic. But as far as it's easier to get a science advisor, and the more people are doing it right now. So in that respect, it's gotten easier. And I'll turn it over to Mike if he wants to add anything.
Yeah. So as a professor, I have to stick up for the science when I'm teaching my students, and when I'm teaching science fiction writers. They're the ones I want to get it right, and I want to point out right and wrong. So I'm a tough audience from that perspective, but I see these things as teachable moments as well. If I'm going to talk about, for instance, Interstellar, I was blown away to see supermassive black holes, my specialty, on the big screen. And they worked so hard to get so many of the science details right. They had real scientists involved. On the other hand, they did some really stupid things. And I could go on at length, I don't need to, but I could go on at length about some things that don't work scientifically there. beyond just the issue that love is the most powerful force in the universe. Some people gripe about in the science fiction movie. But I like to provide alternatives. How could they have changed some plot details, yet maintained the overall story and gotten the science to work? Because it's one thing to make mistakes with the science or to ignore the science rather than, okay, I understand the science and I'm working with it to make a good, correct story. Very often you can stick to getting the science right and make a good story. If you're just doing it, if you're making mistakes out of ignorance, I think that is lazy. And it speaks to a society where, you know, people aren't scientifically literate enough to watch a movie. But for me, it throws me out of the movie. I don't want to be thrown out of the movie. I want to have that suspension of disbelief because they're getting the science consistently right.
You know, in the category of getting about whether or not it's easier or harder, Mike, tell them about Launchpad.
Yeah, so Launchpad is a workshop I put together to give a crash course in astronomy and science communication to professional writers. And our mission at some level is to prevent another Armageddon. Armageddon is a movie that NASA has used in the past to test its people. It's got on average a mistake every minute, ranging from serious science issues to issues about NASA procedures in space and so forth. So we have usually about 15 writers every year, and we bring them in and it's a crash course in astronomy, and we talk about these tropes. We talk about what happens when you're tossed out of the airlock without a suit. So you get that right. Kevin has been one of our guest instructors for Launchpad in the past, and we're not going to have a huge effect on the world of entertainment and Hollywood, but we're going to make fewer mistakes out there and maybe inspire more stories with more and better astronomy, and hopefully inspire the next generation of scientists the way Star Trek helped inspire me.
You know, to be fair, people will criticize you if the science is correct too, because they'll just say, "Oh, it's still science. I don't believe science," because apparently that's a thing now.
Or there's I'm sorry, there's a thing called like a certain plausibility factor. So the classic thing is where things which are right are treated as wrong. So the classic example of this was in 2001: A Space Odyssey, where the original, like if you look at the text, it's supposed to have it's a nuclear powered spacecraft. And so it has these huge glowing fins, radiator fins to like lose in. But of course, you know, the production guys on the movie, like, they took those right out because they didn't want people saying why do you have fins? There's no aerodynamics in space. You've built this aerodynamic space, and that we have to explain it, radiator fins. Now, since then, radiator fins have come back. Like if you look in The Martian, you see it's allowed to have radiator fins. And I think part of this is because the International Space Station is very obvious radiator panels and so on. And we've kind of gone past that point. But there are times when people have had to change things that are true to make them not true, because people have a certain conception of what reality is, and you just don't want to fight the audience on a certain point.
Yeah, I was going to say a few years ago, I could ask you about whether or not it was easier to write now that people have a greater understanding of science, but considering the past couple of years, I don't think that question really applies anymore. So I'll move on to the next one. Do you think that the Hollywood portrayal of science undermines science and reality? For example, TV doctors make cures in the last 10 minutes of an hour-long drama, while in real life it can take years to find a cure and never even happen.
Well, that speaks to one of the points we emphasize again and again and again in the Hollyweird science books. And that is the fact that one of the single most common mistakes is the rate at which phenomena happen or systems evolve and things like of that nature. In the current book, I turn that around a little bit because people are always complaining about this. Oh, it is, you got this cure in a day. Well, I mean, Jane Espenson once wrote in the beginning or in the intro to one of my books that your dramatic tension may dissipate somewhat during that realistically long wait while you sequence DNA. And there was an episode of The Big Bang Theory that is the great example of this. It's the best, where Howard, because he's been to ISS, is chosen to throw out the first pitch at a Los Angeles Angels baseball game. So he gets introduced. He works on the rover. The crowd goes nuts, yay! And he's brought a rover. The rover will deliver the ball from the pitcher's mound to home plate, yay! And then when the rover starts moving at the realistic rate at 1 inch per second, which would get about 12 minutes to get to home plate, the enthusiasm damps quite a bit. And that's why these rates are changed. It simply is to keep the dramatic tension up, because you're making a piece of entertainment. You're not making a documentary unless you're making a documentary. Mm-hmm. So there's always going to be little things, little tweaks done intentionally to heighten the drama. Yeah.
And I would say this idea that bad science is somehow corrupting people from science. I would say that, one, this is not, science fiction movies are not the things that are out there saying global warming is a hoax. They're not the things out there saying vaccines cause autism. If you look at the really big scientific challenges of the day, science fiction movies tend to line up pretty well behind scientists are reasonable people making reasonable decisions, and they're reasonably trustworthy people usually. I mean, you've got the occasional mad scientist who wants to take over the world, fine. But as a whole, they actually are giving very positive images of science. And I think, and again, when you look at the basic sort of literacy level of what even somebody who thinks about what the surface of Mars is, modern science fiction movies have given them. They've become that unofficial curriculum. And specifically to talk about medical science, like we can sneer at some of these shows, but if you go back like Dr. Kildare all the way through or Grey's Anatomy, these are the shows that were the first places, if you look back, that often were speaking to the public about things like child abuse, spousal abuse. There were things like AIDS, all of these, or talking about issues around organ donation and so on. All of those issues were played out, and that's where people got to see them, often in a very sympathetic way and in a surprisingly nuanced way on these shows. Yes, did the actual CBC chem panel, let's zap them again with the defibrillators, even though you're only supposed to use them in one very specific type of heart condition, but we use them for everything. Yeah, that all happened. But in that, people got an awful lot of genuine health information that I don't think they would have gotten any other way.
Michael, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, Buzz Aldrin several years ago complained that science fiction was making NASA look bad because going to space is difficult and dangerous, but Star Trek, Star Wars, you hop in your X-Wing, you don't even have to thread that catheter. You can just get in your X-Wing and be off to Dagobah before apparently you have to use the bathroom. So the reality is harsher, but it is entertainment. And if we were more realistic about our entertainment, well, we can't be, or it'd be boring. You take out all the boring parts, every scene, every page of a book, it's got to be interesting and moving along. And that is one of the things that fiction gives us is a more complicated, long story compressed to just the exciting bits. And that's okay. If it's not entertaining, people won't watch it.
Mm-hmm. About the realistic depiction of space, one of the complaints we often got on Gravity was that, that Mr. Cuarón, Alfonso Cuarón, is anti-space. He's trying to scare people away from going into space. No, it's just that we didn't sanitize it, as Mike just said, and you don't jump in your X-Wing or energize. It's still dangerous. It's still a thing. It's still difficult to go into space. And when we started showing how bad it can be, I mean, you lead off talking with just about how empty it is and devoid of sound, devoid of material, devoid of any debris, and it just goes downhill from there. And some people got really offended saying we were anti-space, when in fact I met the Cuaróns because his son Jonas co-wrote the screenplay, and they were motivated to make that film by the Hubble Servicing Mission IMAX movie. They wanted to recreate the grandeur and impressiveness of space, good and bad. So they were really trying to show the grandeur, and people who got kind of bent out of shape with space is not Star Trek or Stargate said, oh no, I don't like that. They must be anti-space.
Wow. Oh my God. You know, it's funny. They do this with a lot of different things, like in compressing time. They do it with lawyers and law shows all the time because trials can take years, and generally they're done in a couple of days. So that's pretty normal. And I also think that people who complain about science, every person that I have ever interviewed who works for NASA, and I have interviewed a lot of people who work for NASA, all of them credit some sort of sci-fi with the reason that they got into it. So that brings me to the next question. What are your favorite science mistakes in popular TVs and TV shows and movies that are so bad they can only make you laugh now?
I always find it because I'm a technology journalist mostly, and so I always pick Europa Report a little bit of this, because Europa Report was lauded for like being this really cool, science-driven thing about finding life in Europa and how good it is. But I actually like to point it out because it's a little bit like when depending upon your domain of expertise, you can really shade how you feel about it, and sometimes you have to learn to like maybe let your particular expertise like just let it go a little bit. So for instance, a lot of scientists and science people like science really love Europa Report. As somebody who has looked at space technology and has cover that as my beat, it is the most worst designed spacecraft in the universe. There are all kinds of problems with it. We know how to deal with hydrazine leaks. We've got like hydrazine leak. If you come with your spacesuit with a hydrazine leak, we could stuff in the International Space Station right now, because that's a risk would do it. The idea that this spacecraft would drop off the radar, we could, it's a hot object in a cold solar system. We'd be able to follow it all the way along. We'd be able to point a radio telescope at it and like pick up from their terribly designed communication system, which is also somehow messed in with it. So the engineering on that show is just terrible, just terrible. But it's still a really kind of interesting and worthwhile movie, because it's telling you about this story, this grander story, that life in our solar system might be this kind of bigger, more interesting story, and what might be risk to find out that story. So that's kind of that human element in it. So that's an example where the spacecraft is so bad it's funny, but I still enjoy the movie nonetheless.
A line from Star Trek II comes to mind at this point. Would you like a tranquilizer? Clearly you're very passionate about this, and you know what, we all get that way. And something you mentioned, we saw earlier, you mentioned about when it's my science. Mike, you should have seen yourself when you start talking about black holes. I mean, you got really animated. When it's our thing, that's something we're going to address in the current book is what you bring with it, because what you bring to that science accuracy thing depends on what sets your bar, is what your background is. And we've got several examples of two people with different expertise watching different films, and two people, a psychologist, this is a real example, a psychologist and a physicist watching Inception. The psychologist might freak out, and while the physicist loves it, and that might reverse for something else, for another film. But back to the actual question asked, our poster child in the first two Hollyweird science books for the bad science, the science mistake that gets put onto the screen, and then there's a screenwriter, a future screenwriter in the audience, and they grow up, and once they're writing, they reuse it again, and it just keeps getting propagated, is what's called the 10% myth. The notion that we only use 10% of our brains. Imagine what would happen if we use them all. Now, in Eureka, that was actually written into one episode, and I made it slightly better because we have our character Henry Deacon say, we only use 10% of our brain at any given time. And that's a lot closer to being correct, because we have a word for when you're using 100% of your brain at once, and that's called a seizure. But so yeah, the 10% myth is something that just needs to die, like quicksand did. How often you see well, I can't say that because quicksand is coming up in a movie that I might have worked on. But anyway, it's in the trailer, so I can say that. But anyway, I think that has finally died. I don't think, we had Limitless. They actually had a plausible-ish reason, explanation, but I'm just hoping that goes away. I hope no more Lucy's. We're done with that one, I hope.
So for me, my go-to bad science that's funny movie is Armageddon, but I don't want to talk about Armageddon, even though there's a howler every minute or two in that movie. Let me talk about a scene in a movie that I think is really pretty good and I like quite a lot, which is Contact, based on Carl Sagan's novel, starring Jodie Foster. She's looking at the stars with Matthew McConaughey in the movie, and she says, there are 400 billion stars out there just in our galaxy alone. If only 1 out of 1,000,000 of those had planets, and just 1 out of 1,000,000 of those had life, and just 1 out of 1,000,000 of those had intelligent life, there would be literally millions of civilizations out there. 400 billion, that's 4 times 10 to the 2 times 10 to the 9, it's 10 to the 11. Every factor of 1,000,000 is subtracting a 6 from that 11. She's just demonstrated that we're something special. But working with this kind of powers of 10 is so natural to astronomers. We don't really get that wrong in the way that she did. And this was pointed out to Zemeckis, and he's like, I don't care. This plays well. So
I will say that Contact actually is one of those occasions where I feel the movie adaptation was better than the book. I mean, Carl Sagan was great, but as a fiction writer, there's a lot of stuff in that the book really did that the movie did a great job of just excising out, and then we are left with these beautiful, incredible set pieces like when she does go through the worm, or when they're picking up the signal for the first time, and there's this contagious excitement of them trying to like nail it down and get it more, and it's just this really extended long sequence of this and you just imagine the Earth just being pounded with these radio waves coming in, which wasn't one. Actually, I felt that scene's much more dramatic in the movie than in the book. Like, I emotionally resonated with much more in the movie, and so I thought that was one of the rare cases where I really enjoyed the movie. I mean, the book there's some stuff that get taken out, but I feel it's a tighter story in movie form. Yeah.
See, I agree with that. There's a but, though, because the value of pi was very important in the book. And the producer, or the studio, we interviewed the producer, Linda Obst, for Hollyweird Science, and she was really frustrated that they made her excise the whole importance of pi. And I mean, the end of the book where pi becomes really significant, I mean, I was practically moved to tears by that. It was gone. It was just so I was disappointed at that, but generally I agree with Stephen. There were some things that just the really good stuff rose to the top in the film, and I agree with that part. The part is really effective that where we finally get the signal.
You see this in historical fiction as well, where I'm a crazy history buff, and it drives me crazy sometimes when stuff is wrong, but sometimes it's just fun to critique it. However, I have heard some of the things that are wrong come back out of people's mouths as though it were true. So in what ways can popular entertainment help reinforce science in the face of current fake controversies such as climate change, vaccinations, and COVID-19 conspiracy theories?
If you go on social media in the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, I saw on my feed, at least, a lot of people were watching Contagion, which was a 2011 film. And if you watch that film, especially, or watch it again if it's been a while, it is a blow-by-blow description of what happened during the COVID-19 pandemic. Another kind of subtle point is that in science-themed and science fiction films, you generally get your science out of the way up front, some kind of exposition, this is what's going on, and then about 2/3 of the way along, you get a little bit more, this is what's really going on. And in Contagion, you had a never-ending drip, drip, drip of science. And I mean, even down to the human reaction, even down to it's forsythia, that's your hydroxychloroquine. And the parallels were fantastic. The only small thing, and you can't even say they got it wrong, it just wasn't relevant to this pandemic, was the emphasis on fomites. And a fomite, anything you touch that can carry more disease, is a fomite. And initially they thought COVID was fomite borne, and that led to Dr. Fauci saying, don't wear a mask because you'll touch your mask, touch your face. Basically, your face becomes a fomite, and that turned out to be not right. And people who aren't familiar with the process of science, seeing it play out in real time, correcting things, said, oh, scientists don't know what they're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
In politics, being a flip-flopper is a death sentence, right? If you can put that label on John Kerry or some other politician. In science, it isn't, and it shouldn't be, because when we learn new information, we do new experiments, we analyze data, we learn new things, and we should change our minds if we were wrong before. So the fact that we update our understanding of things is a strength of science, not a weakness. And any kind of movie or TV shows that demonstrate that special quality to science have the ability to really help us make our way, navigate through all the conflicting information and changing information through something like a pandemic or increasing understanding of climate science.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if I don't mind me, before I jump in, before you jump in, Steve, I'm going to follow on that. One of the things that Contagion movie did, again, also very subtle, but the public is conditioned that science is a collection of facts. And I have been guilty of sort of purveying that by being on a documentary or two. Here's fact, 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 rather than it being a process, rather than it being a way of looking at things, rather than it being a collection of skills that most scientists have. You know, like the ability to analyze data and the ability to understand what you mean, you know, when you're using technical terms and things like that. And in Contagion, what you saw is more of a process behind science than you saw just here are the facts, rather than having these scientist characters step out, you know, vomit some exposition and then step back. This one, you saw the constant process, oh no, we're wrong on this point, we need to change. You know, you saw that process play out. So that's another case where we saw a film, a drama depict science in a very realistic way that will help us, that can help us in the future by emphasizing this is a good film, this is not so good. Anyway, I'm sorry if I jumped in, Stephen, but I wanted to, it was relevant following on from Mike.
One thing I loved about the pandemic was that the vaccines were actually developed very quickly.
You're probably the only one who loved
pro-COVID-19. That's a brave stance.
Yeah.
Here's what I loved in terms of being an educator, a scientist, a scientific educator. The vaccines were developed almost immediately. They were raring to go. They had this technology, and it was the testing that took the better part of a year. Okay, it was slow because they were going to test it, and people are like, "Oh my gosh, it went so fast! They must have done it badly." No, it was still slow, but they had developed the vaccine so quickly because they were ready for this kind of event.
Mm-hmm.
From that side of things, they weren't ready to test and develop and then administer billions of doses. This is why we're still where we are. But
mm-hmm.
People got to see some of this process going on.
And to be clear, we had a vaccine in March
mm-hmm.
last year. I sat in on a National Academy of Sciences entertainment exchange Zoomcast, an educational thing, and they had 4 virologists talk, and they said we have vaccines right now, and they just walked us through the testing process. And the first, you know, like the first test, you don't even care if it works. Is it going to kill somebody? Is the first series of tests. And then, you know, you move on, you have 3 phases of tests, but they said, we have it right now. We're going to take forever, you know, test it, and maybe we'll get it out by the end of the year, maybe a little later. Mm-hmm. But they were saying right then, we already have it. We got it in a couple months. Anyway, Stephen, I'm sorry if I keep jumping.
No. I think the thing that I would like to see people do is a little more, is that science is messy. I would like them to see, so, you know, that classic montage where the scientists are trying to work something out and all the things stop working, they get their frustrated face and then they get, I would like to see that expanded out a little bit more, and actually maybe some of that be actually used as a plot point instead of it just being condensed as a montage, because I think it's important for people to see that yes, you go to all these backwards. And the other thing I would like to see more is more saying that to be a scientist, you don't have to look a certain way. You don't have to dress a certain way. You don't even have to like a lot of us are here nerds and geeks. You don't actually have to be a nerd or a geek. You don't have to like any comic book at all. You don't have to even like science fiction. And you can be a scientist, and a really good one. And you don't even have to be that great at maths either, which is another thing that people expect you have to be some sort of super genius. A lot of times you don't feel that you have to be a genius to be a scientist. Well, you have to be a scientist. You have to be curious. You have to be imaginative. And yes, you got to learn a little bit of rigor and a certain amount of mathematics and so on. But really, it's a way of looking at the world. You don't have to be a certain type of person already, as long as you're looking at the world that way.
I agree with that. About you really kind of don't have to be super great at math. I'm a computational physicist. I'm good enough,
Nerd!
but I what?
Nerd.
Oh yeah. So, well, yeah, like that. Who's that news to? But what you do have to be is math has to be your go-to. That kind of has to be your first. I turn things into math equations like all day, just because that's my go-to. And sometimes you just need to plug in. Is this a big number? Is this a little number? Okay, I can make my decision. That's my thought process. Go ahead, Stephen. Nerd. I thought you were gonna weigh in again, because that's
no. But I think even if you're having difficulty, you're finding, oh, I'm not a maths person, I can't do maths. If you're actually using the math for something, if you're actually using the math for science, the math becomes a lot easier. It becomes a lot easier because you understand what it's there for. Math as a purely abstract thing, that is like, some people will take that to a fish to water. But if you're struggling with the math and you're still thinking, oh, I want to be a scientist, but maybe I can't because I've got this, you can find a way through. There are literally bucks full of different approaches, because even scientists themselves struggle with the math. And there are literally shelves full of like different approaches to certain problems. And the trick there is you might need to find someone to help you look and find out, because finding that stuff can be tough. So maybe it's about finding a teacher who can help you a little bit further down the line. And that kind of mentoring, actually, I think is also something we could show a little bit more movies. Instead of having everybody being a self-created genius, have someone get stuck on a problem, ask for some help. Just like that's one of the great scenes in War Games, which is like, again, it still holds up so well. He gets stuck. He asks for help. They point him in the right direction, and then he goes on his merry way. He doesn't do it all up himself. So never ask for help.
Can I put in one more thought before? Oh, Mike will follow me, but I had one more thing I want to follow with Stephen, is that you mentioned the rigor of science, and that's true. In fact, there's an old question they ask physicists to determine: do you want to be a theoretical physicist or do you want to be an experimental physicist? Would you rather spend a week finding a minus sign or fixing a leaky pipe, or finding a leak in a pipe? And
that's why my degree is in experimental physics. Love those pipes.
I'm an observational astronomer, and we have a similar thing. Would you rather be right, or would you rather be clever? You're an observer, an experimentalist. You have to be right. Theorists just have to be clever, and they get all kinds of credit, even if they're wrong in the long run, as they typically are. But I'm showing my bias off there.
No.
The knives are out now. That's it.
One of the other things like math, computer hacking looks way too easy in TV and movies. They cure the disease in the last 10 minutes. Any hacker can break into any computer system in seconds. And they type ridiculously fast on computer systems that they may have never seen or interacted with, and that kind of drives me nuts too. So
I type that fast, but I cannot hack anything. So in terms of depictions of science and scientists on film or TV, what are some examples of gold standard projects that got it right? How did they do it, and how thin is the line between good and bad?
I'm going to make a plug now for my God, we came in for all mankind. There we go. Brain fog, pandemic brain fog.
See, it happened to you too.
That show is great because those guys have done their homework. They are able to go into little details, like the whole dispute about like how we have to have this androgynous docking mechanism for the Soyuz project. That's based on real stuff. Now, it was a Russian guy, Vladimir Smrutnikov, who actually came up with the design. But because they live in an alternate universe, they can fit all that kind of stuff without it like breaking things or being wrong, because they're in an alternate universe. But they wonderfully they mine like the Sea Dragon, all of this stuff, what might have been stuff, all this true history from sort of the engineering backstories of the Apollo program and some of the later programs. And so that's, at the moment, that show is my jam.
That's a great show.
Yeah. Go ahead, Mike.
I'll go ahead on Contact again. They have scientists doing science, dealing with problems, and they do a pretty good job there. A couple of things to pick on. You're doing radio astronomy. You don't have to put on earphones and listen to it. You know, a little bit of something maybe to throw to people to relate to radio astronomy, but radio is just another kind of light. It's not something you would listen to that way. Yeah, so I'll just stop there.
Well, since the other two guys took the two things that had boiled to the top of my list, let me answer the other part of that question, the line between good and bad. And let me use Eureka as an example, because Eureka, you know, we tempted to do some of the things that Stephen mentioned earlier, as far as making our scientists not all be straight white males in a lab coat. And we showed them a very different backgrounds, all contributing to solutions and at times contributing to the problems. But given the nature of that show being a dramedy, what we had to do is find technology that was pushing the performance envelope, and then have this other project pushing the performance envelope, and somehow get them to interact in really weird ways, and ignoring things like lab protocols and how procedure driven laboratories are, how procedure and process driven science is. And so you had the people representing scientists. I think we did a pretty good job at showing them in ways in which they hadn't been shown before, having real lives outside of work, having real lives that aren't necessarily nerd driven. And at the same time, we needed to make a dramedy, so we need to ignore some of the aspects of science to get us into our situations. So the line can be fairly nebulous. I mean, and it can be a permeable membrane. Let's go with that.
So we have about 15 minutes left. So I'm curious, what other things, I mean, we talked about time compression and things like that, but what other things sort of help you find the right balance between scientific accuracy and entertainment?
So for me, it goes right back to, I think, what Mike was saying earlier about laziness. And part of what we do in our books, and sometimes when we talk to people like scientists, is we're explaining to you that some of these things that get changed around, they're not changed around because the creators are lazy or stupid or ignorant. They have specific story needs, or they have specific production needs. They can't have a cast of 100 people, of 100 specialists, each working on their bit. They need, you know, sort of to do a lot of consolidation, stuff like this. And this just works with basic, like okay, A, there's the cost of hiring all those people, but B, you know, imagine in a 42-minute show, which is actually what an hour of television is really, and you had 10 characters, then each character gets 4.2 minutes of screen time on average. Okay, that's to all of their emotional arcs, everything gets served that. Now imagine you've got 20 people. Well, it just becomes ridiculous. So that's why your cast is a certain size. And then again, and I have to say, we can do amazing things with CGI. CGI has become so incredibly cheap now. We can do things that would require full up movie studio budgets to do. And we can do crazy, and we can do amazing stuff like that. But at the same time, it still requires somebody to know all those bits and pieces and to really work in that production universe. And it can take a long time to get those production aspects of the set when maybe your main impulse is, I just need a transport to get people from A to B, and maybe I'm not worrying about like the fact that the 7 subsystems of every spacecraft must have, and so on and so forth. So I think that because I'm making a show and I'm cranking out an episode every week, so I think if you a little bit of like things like those, they're like, okay, I don't mind those mistakes. But if you come on and you say we took every pain, we got NASA, we did all this kind of stuff like this, we're just right down the line, and then you're just you see these very tropey, lazy things, that's where you kind of lost me, because I think you're just rehashing. It's not even that it's technically, but you're just rehashing and you're not being original. Like, show me something new. I'm giving you my attention. I don't want to see something I could have seen in 1984 or 1974, or see when they did it best in, the Quartermain experiment in 1954. Like, show me something new. You know what I mean?
The Science and Entertainment Exchange, which is a branch of the National Academy of Sciences in Los Angeles, they will provide scientists to productions. If you call 1-844-NEED-SCI, you'll get Rick Lovert or his assistant, literally 1-844-NEED-SCI, and they will help you with your production. And one of their operating principles is we are not the science police. Our goal, our co-author Jessica, who couldn't be with us, she's on a flight at the moment, she likes to use the word plausible-ish. The goal is to get things plausible-ish. Science fiction has been a genre predicated usually on at least one inaccuracy. Go with me on this really fantastic idea, and we'll do our best to get everything else as right as possible. Mm-hmm. So did you try? Is kind of a bar. Did you try? Is it wrong and didn't have to be? I can't tell you how many times I have given a writer a plug and play term for something they made up. They pulled this term out of their backside, and then I give, no, here's a real term that really does what you want it to do. And more often than not, you know what the answer is? Well, we'd have to explain that. Did you explain this technobabble you pulled out of your butt? For some reason, when it's real, there's the belief we have to explain it. And I can't explain that. That's one question we asked a lot of the writers we interviewed for the book. But did you try? Did you, in the cases like those kind of interactions are transparent to the user, to the watcher, the viewer. But you can kind of tell over time. So did you try? Did you do the best possible job? Did you only break the rules when you had to? And most importantly, is it's less important to obey the rules of this universe as it is to obey the rules of your universe, the universe you established in your show. You need to stick to your laws. In Trek, example, they've made up a lot of things, but they do a pretty good job of sticking to it. In fact, we interviewed a couple of former science advisors from Star Trek, and one said, Narain Shankar said, science advisor on Star Trek isn't about adherence to actual science. It's about the adherence to made up stuff. So go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, I agree with that. If you can do the real stuff, do the real stuff. If you're going to make up stuff, make it consistent. Consistency to a set of rules is part and parcel of science and engineering. Mm-hmm. And you can demonstrate science, you can demonstrate engineering, and science and engineering are interesting things to do intrinsically. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of troubleshooting. There's a lot of setbacks. You have to solve problems. You have to do experiments, and an experiment doesn't fail typically. An experiment gives you information, no matter what the result of that experiment is. If it's a good, useful experiment. So a TV show like House is maybe not the best human being in the world, and maybe not the best scientist in the world, but the process, they go through failures and they say, okay, we tried this. This can rule out this disease. And then we have to do something else to rule out another disease and start narrowing it down like a puzzle. And science and engineering are solving puzzles. And I think that's intrinsically interesting to a lot of people. And I will say, and movies like The Martian and TV shows like For All Mankind, we get to see NASA scientists helping solve these problems. Apollo 13,
Hmm.
um, and that's interesting to anybody who's interested in solving problems and machinery and science. What I would like to see less of is the techno babble or the CGI version of it, where the equations start flying across as some character looks
Right.
off into space. They're trying to capture some kind of genius, but they just it makes that character less relatable when really uh, they're going to have to explain what the solution is.
Hmm.
And it shouldn't be a mysterious process like this because science is a process.
Hmm.
Right? And people can do that. You don't have to be a super genius. It's a process.
Hmm.
Michael, I saw that on a commercial today, the equations. I swear to you, earlier today I saw that. So I'd love to know what you think the one thing you wish audiences understood better about what you do.
Um, as far as being a science advisor, I'm going to borrow from Jessica here because this is her one of her favorite things is, and I agree with this. It's that science advisors don't have copy editor like say over the science. We advise, and sometimes our advice and sometimes the real science is at variance with what they want to do. I got a great example, a great story. I told this dozens of times before, but I'll tell it again. On gravity, a common complaint, because it's a reasonable complaint, is that the International Space Station is in one inclination, one tilt of its orbit, and ISS is and the Hubble is in another. And you can't get from one orbit to the other in the shuttle, let alone on one backpack of of propellant and oxygen. And I told the Quarons that. We met, our first time we met was like 3 hours in the lobby of Chateau Marmont on Sunset in Hollywood. Yeah, it's a nice place.
Fancy.
And we sat there and we talked, and he showed me some animatics. I got to see 3 years before they filmed it, the scene where Stone wiggles out of her spacesuit and the birth. And I told them at the time that you realize that these two orbits, the closest they ever get, the absolute closest, this will never happen in the real world closest is roughly between here and the border of Mexico, So I said, that's and so here's an idea. So I'm just going to throw this out there. So it wouldn't work. And I said, we know that the shuttle won't be flying by the time this movie airs. It'll be done. So it's a reasonable design consideration the next generation telescope being in orbit easily serviceable from the International Space Station. So why don't we create a fictitious space telescope? We'll call it the Cannon Space Telescope after Annie Cannon, an early female astronomer, and have a thematic link with our main character, Dr. Stone. He said, and then we have something more plausible. And then we hit up Canon Camera for product placement dollars. And Mr. Quaron said, you missed your calling in life. You should have been a producer. but he explained to me then something we let off with is that their motivation was the IMAX movie of the Hubble servicing mission. And that was their creative touchstone, and they were going to go with that. So it wasn't that they didn't know the science. It wasn't that they were lazy or stupid. It wasn't that the advisor didn't cue them in. It's just the direction they wanted to go. And and then people will say, well, you couldn't get from one to the other. You can't. You're right. But if our characters can't get to our defined goal, what that movie becomes is open water in space, where wetsuits become spacesuits and circling sharks become orbital debris. And I don't like that movie as much because they all die. So yes, it's that back to where we started, is that we don't have copy editor like say, and sometimes that's okay.
Anyone else want to jump in?
Yeah, as a scientist, I touched on this earlier, but I would like people in general to understand that science is a process. It's not easy. It's not fast. It's not perfect, but it's the only way of generating new reliable knowledge. There are no equivalents to it. Gut feelings, religious text, or just political desire. These are not alternatives for knowing things. Okay, so all other approaches are worse. Science is where it's at. It's not perfect, but there is expertise still in the world, and we need to respect and understand that. And if the entertainment, the TV shows, movies, books, whatever, get that across, great. And it's hard to do that while still being entertaining.
So I think so. I write a lot of nonfiction. So my day job is nonfiction, but there's still some similarities here in that I have to take source material and then I have to push it out. But I'm pushing it for my readers. I'm not writing for the benefit of my sources. And so again, just like I'm a science journalist. I'm not a science communicator, which means that sometimes I'm going to be critical of my sources, which sometimes I don't get. But also one of the biggest issues that we have, and we kind of touched on here, is that if you're in a field, precision is very important. Like you have to be able to talk to each other very, very precisely. If you are outside that field looking in, the most important thing is not precision, it's accuracy. You want an accurate view, but it's quite imprecise. And what that means is what we mean by accuracy and precision is that if I say to you the value of pi is 3.1, okay, that's accurate, but not very precise. If I say it's 3.14 and I go on, that's both accurate and precise. If I say the value of pi is 1.6487424, I'm being inaccurate, but very precise. But scientists like to be both very accurate and very precise and right down that little line. And I'm saying if you're not part of that field, you don't understand all the things. The precision is just going to overwhelm you. You just want a nice, low precision, but high accuracy, is as accurate as you can get it, view of the world. And I think that applies. I think that's something is misunderstood about how journalism works. And I think also sometimes it's something that's misunderstood about how science gets translated to the screen, a little bit. And that's something. Sometimes I find myself when I'm talking to both those audiences about what I do, the same issue kind of crops up in both cases.
And I just
to underscore Stephen's point, in the codes that I write for my simulations, I need pi to 16 decimal places, and it needs to be to at least 16 decimal places. Too many, and you induce inaccuracy. Too few, you induce an inaccuracy. 16 is where it's at.
You have it memorized to 16 digits?
10. I don't have all 16, so only 10. Sorry.
I feel like this is a challenge.
I'm not going to go there because I'm not going to get to 16. I mean,
I know we have to wrap. So before we go, where can we find you guys online? Let's start with Kevin.
I am Kevin Grazier, one word, on Twitter. Also on Facebook and LinkedIn. Find me there. And IMDb, but that's not really social media. Oh, and ResearchGate if you're a scientist.
And Stephen?
You can find me on Twitter at Stephen Cass, and that's spelled not the American way. It's StephenCass.
Michael?
I'm on Facebook, and I still have a web page if people still go to those, MikeBrotherton.com. Although I no longer blog. I think that is so 10 years ago.
You're old.
Well, you can find me at jennabush.net. See, website. And you can find me on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram, Jenna Bush, BUSCH, like the beer, not the president. And thank you guys so much for being here for the panel. And thank you guys for watching.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.